Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Man Who Turned into a Cat by J. Wentworth Day. Cambridge creeps with ghosts. Since it is a city near as old as written English history, that is as one should expect it to be. This place of chiming bells, of soaring towers and rose-red battlements, of alleyways of legends and courts of splendor, is haunted not only by memories of great men and by the shades of Donish eccentrics who have vanished like grey moths into the dusk of time, but has also here and there an inheritance of macabre horror. Consider Jesus College. Began as the nunnery of St. Radegonde in the 12th century. It sits behind a long, sun-warmed, very old wall of red brick which marches along one side of Jesus Lane, full of color and warmth and old stories, full of reflected memories of men who passed this way, talking and laughing, and then died, and perhaps linger on as amiable spirits. It is a sort of old wall, which, like the faded gilt and smooth leather of an old book, promises flowers within, scent of thyme and lavender and lilies, tall in the sun, and of roses, whose wild far roots sprang from the fields of Navarre. All these sights and sounds and memories and people this old wall seems to promise. You feel it is the guardian of them all, and so indeed it is. It is a sure and certain thing that Cromwell's Roundheads came here. They clattered down the stone path, stamped and rattled under that great doorway, and kept their guard in what is now the porter's lodge. They slept in the rooms of the gate tower, and it is in that tower that we shall find our first ghost of Jesus College. The tale starts in 1643. Strafford had been beheaded 2 years earlier. Charles I, having lost his one strong man, was waging a civil war with all the indecision of a weak and kindly man. Cromwell has occupied Cambridge with his Bible-banging, psalm-singing soldiers of the Eastern Counties Association. Like all self-proclaimed soldiers of the Lord, they were the biggest humbug unhung. Vandalism and sacrilege were everyday affairs. Their violent behavior and willful damage were appalling. They gloried in destruction. With the zest of the ignorant, the fury of the envious, they smashed works of art, broke windows of old beauty, and hammered lovely stone tracery to rubble. Contemporary records in college tell of the damning tale. They were men of mean souls, enemies of loveliness, haters of tradition, downcasters of beauty and sanctity. Before that sad summer of 1643 had run its course of fear and trembling, 14 of the 16 fellows of the college had been expelled. 2 only remained in residence. With them were about half a score of scholars. The rest of the college was full of Cromwell's ranting, canting troops. The 2 fellows who remained were John Boylston and Thomas Allen. Allen committed suicide. That bald statement hides a lot. First, we must bear in mind that 6 months before Allen died, that ignorant fanatic, William Dowsing, the scourge of churches and chapels, descended on Cambridge like a plague. He was armed with parliamentary powers to reform churches, and for that matter, college chapels. This ignorant oaf wrought monstrous damage in Cambridge. It is on record that on December 28, 1642, in the presence of John Boylston, he dug up the steps, i.e., the college chapel altar, and broke down superstitions and angels, 120 at the least. A certain Dr. John Sherman, a fellow of Jesus, took careful note of these barbaric proceedings. He incorporated the whole disgraceful tale in his Latin history of the college, which was later published when Charles II ascended the throne, and the English air was once more fit to breathe. Sherman records that Boylston was not the only witness of the desecration of the altar. Thomas Allen was there also. Dr. Sherman remarks, "The one, Boylston, stood behind a curtain to witness the evil work; the other, afflicted to behold the exequies of his alma mater, made his life a filial offering at her grave, and to escape the hands of wicked rebels laid violent hands on himself." So far, so good. It was for long taken for granted by those who did not know the darker side of the picture, that Allen had committed suicide. Sherman did not know, or perhaps did not remember, a certain Adoniram Byfield. This man, Byfield, was a Roundhead chaplain, attached to Cromwell's troops in Cambridge. You can get some idea of the mean, cribbled character of the man, full of fanaticism and dark superstition, if you burrow about in the library of Jesus until you come on a pudgy, leather-bound collection of old sermons of the Commonwealth times. Amongst the sermons is one dated 1643 and described as a faithful admonition of the Baylite sin of the enchanters and stargazers, preached to the Colonel Cromwell's soldiers in St. Pulchre's church in Cambridge by the fruitful minister Adoniram Byfield, late departed unto God, in the year 1643, touching that of Acts the 7th verse 43, you took up the tabernacle of Moloch, the star of your god, Rembrandt figures which you made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. The title of this sermon, if it can be dignified as such, lays bare the mind and soul of Byfield. He stands revealed as one of those fanatical Bible thumpers who played remorselessly on the ignorance of the Roundhead troops and inflamed their superstitious prejudices against the carnal learning of the university scholars. Byfield was almost as ignorant as the men. He was quite as superstitious. He was one of those raving preachers whose like is still found in the eastern counties today, where the country will dismiss them in one telling a word as ranters. This weasel of a man with his dark mind was given rooms on the first floor of the entrance tower of Jesus, immediately above the great gate. Below his bedchamber was the porter's lodge. The troops quartered in the college used it as their armory. There they kept their swords, pistols, and muskets. Above Byfield's room, on the third and last floor of the great tower, kept Thomas Allen. He was a man of mystery. Byfield saw him only half a dozen times in the first 3 months of his sojourn in the gate tower. The truth is that Allen probably kept to his rooms as much as possible, at any rate by daylight, because the moment he appeared in the college, he was hooted, whistled at, and insulted by the soldiers. For when the long vacation of 1643 began, Allen was the only member of the college still in residence. Apart from his natural reluctance to expose himself to insults and possible showers of mud and stones, Allen was a mystic. His mind and enthusiasm were deep in the sciences of mathematics and astronomy. Both were regarded in those days as little less than black magic. Mathematicians were branded as necromancers. Thomas Hobbes says that in his own days at Oxford, mathematics was held to be smutched with the black art. Many a country squire and noble lord refused to send his son to Oxford University for fear that the youth's mind and soul should become poisoned by the black art of mathematics. It is scarcely to be wondered at, therefore, that the small black pit of ignorance, which represented the mind of Adoniram Byfield, should be seething with prejudice and hatred against such stargazers and enchanters as Allen. Hence his sermon. There was a reason for the delivery of that sermon. First of all, a Cromwellian cornet, full of holy faith and little sense, fell down one of the steep, dark staircases of the college one night and broke his neck, just after he had left a prayer meeting in an upper chamber. Then 2 or 3 soldiers were stricken down with dysentery. These occurrences started a great deal of gossip. The soldiers were convinced that the last scholar in the college, the mysterious Allen, was cursing them with his black art, bewitching them with his spells. All this sank into the little mind of Byfield. There it gathered force until he was convinced that Allen was a magician. We cannot altogether blame Byfield, for, night after night, he heard the voice of his mysterious neighbor in the room above, mumbling on in a ceaseless rise and fall of conversation. It went on hour after hour. No other voice gave answer. None of the words made any intelligible sense to the listening ears of Byfield. More than once he caught sight of Alan standing before a blackboard mounted on an easel. It was chalked with white figures and symbols, probably the most elementary mathematical calculations. To Byfield's mind, they were the invisible signs of black magic, the alphabet of the devil. On more than one night of stars, Byfield stood in the courtyard below and watched Alan's lighted window. More than once he saw Alan come to the window, put his spyglass to his eye, and turn it towards the stars. What else could this be but a ghastly telegraphy with the black spirits of the night? Once he swore he heard the ceaseless mumble and muttering above him change to a sudden shrill high cry. He heard three words, charged with evil and terror. Avant, Satanas, avant. What else could that be but the magician, the necromancer, the dabbler in devilries, shrinking in terror from his dark master, Satan himself, who had just paid him a visit in the oak-paneled chamber above Byfield's head. A few nights later something happened which gave the Roundhead parson fresh grounds for fear. He heard Alan's door open cautiously above him. He heard Alan creep quietly down the steep, unlit oaken staircase, past his own door, a flickering candle in his hand. Byfield saw the thin line of pale yellow light under his own door. Cautiously, he lifted the latch of his door, opened it, crept down the stairs, and saw Alan pass into the armory beneath the room which is the porter's lodge today. Byfield slipped down the stairs and into the court below. Through the lighted window, Byfield saw Alan walk up to a rack of pistols hanging on the wall. He took one down, cocked it, raised it to his eye, as though taking aim, then lowered it, tried the weight of it in his hand, and finally put it back again. Then he crept quietly out of the armory and trod silently up the staircase by the light of his flickering candle to his own mysterious room high in the top of the tower. Next day, one of the 6 soldiers died. Byfield put 2 and 2 together. They added up to all that he had ever suspected, and worse. Then began a new source of terror. Night after night, as Byfield lay quaking in his bed, muttering psalms to keep his spirits up and the evil spirits at bay, he heard Alan's door open. Immediately afterwards, soft, quick footsteps pattered down the narrow oaken staircase. They fled past his door to the bottom of the stairs and vanished noiseless into the night. 2 or 3 hours later, the same quick, soft steps returned, pattering at a natural speed up the oaken stairs, pitch dark, be it remembered, and into the room above. Then he heard Alan's door close. Each night Cromwell's parson lay cold with fear in his bed, listening, praying, clutching his Bible, calling on his God to save him, racking his brain to know what those ghastly steps might mean. He decided that they were the footsteps of the evil one himself. But in what form did Satan visit his slave and servant in that room of mystery and cabalistic symbols overhead? Finally, Byfield screwed up his courage. He waited, candle in hand, prayers on his lips, until one night the soft, swift feet fled by his door. Then he opened the door, holding the candle high aloft, and peered down the dark stairs. He saw nothing. The following night, pale with fright and grim with resolve, he flung the door open again as the fleet fled downstairs. Luckily, a lantern in the armory threw a pale yellow shaft of light across the foot of the stairs. By its light, Byfield saw a cat, huge and black, whisked down the stairs and vanished into the dark night. He knew that 2 hours later it would return. Faintly, up the stairs above his head, Byfield heard papers rustling in the wind in Alan's room. The door stood half open. A flickering candle shed yellow quavering light down the stairs. Not a sound came from the room. The muttering undertones of the necromancer's voice were stilled. Only the wind and the night silences possessed the room of magic. Quietly Byfield crept upstairs. He peered through the half-open door of the top-floor room. The room was empty. He entered softly. There was the blackboard with its magic figures and numerals. There were the open books written Latin, that ungodly tongue, and papers and quill pens and endless pages of closed writing, the visible signs of the devil's work that went on night after night. There, on a small table by the window, stood the spyglass, the prisms, and other devil's instrument, at whose foul use he could only guess. There was no Thomas Allen. Yet no human footsteps had descended the staircase since the dusk had gloomed into darkness. What then was the cat, huge, black, swift and fell, that had whisked down the stairs on feet soft and quick as the wind? Was it the devil in the form of his own favorite animal? Or was it Thomas Allen, translated by his own magic into the body of a great cat, and now launched into the starlit night on another errand of death? Who would be the next victim among the soldiery by dawn? What Christian spirit was even now being caught up in the foul web of the muttering enchanter? Adoniram Byfield asked himself these questions. There could only be one answer. He pursed his thin lips and crept quietly down to the armory. The horn lantern still hung from a chain in the ceiling. Its fat, tall candle shed yellow light out of the open door into the entrance arch, flooding the bottom steps of the stairs. Whatever returned to Allan's chamber, man, cat, or devil, or all three in one form, must pass through that broad belt of yellow light. Adoniram turned his eyes to the rack of 6 horse pistols hanging on the wall. There were only 5. He took one down, primed it carefully from a tiny flask of fine priming powder. Then he took up a large powder horn, full of pistol powder of a coarser grain, tipped a full charge down the barrel, rammed down a bullet as thick as his little finger, cocked the pistol, taking note that the lock clicked sweetly, and made sure that the priming powder lay well and truly in the pan beneath the flint. Then he shrank into the shadows of the wall, his eyes fixed on the lighted space without the door. An hour passed. He heard the bells of Cambridge ring out to the wheeling stars their carillon of midnight. They boomed and chimed. So midnight came and went. Well, Adoniram knew that from now till 2 or 3 of the clock was the time when ghosts rose whitely from the graves, tombs opened, spectral choirs sang in softly lit chapels of abomination, and dark spirits were abroad on creaking wings. Still, he stood there stiff against the wall, pale and grim, too intent to feel the cold, too fanatic to allow his ghostly fears to let his trigger finger tremble. Any minute now, within the next hour, the thing, cat or man or devil, would return. What if it flashed past him before he could fire? What if it fled up the stairs ahead of him, entered his own room, and cast its black spell therein? Suddenly he became aware of a presence. Unseen, unheard, it was out there in the darkness. Yet he felt it. Then, without sound or movement, it was there in the patch of light. Not 6 feet away, a cat, black, malign, green-eyed with fury, fur on end. Adoniram leveled the great horse pistol. He cried, triumphant hoarse, God shall shoot at them, suddenly shall they be wounded, and fired. The heavy report thundered and echoed in the stone doorway, up the narrow oaken stairs, and re-echoed with a crash of sound from the far walls of the inner grass-grown court. A ghastly cry, not animal, not human, stabbed the night. It was the scream of a soul in torment. The cat, if it were a cat, whisked into the darkness with the speed of the devil. Adoniram put the smoking horse pistol, it had jumped in his hand, with a heavy recoil like a bucking horse, back into the rack. He felt exultant. A great glow warmed his heart and soul. The deed was done. The evil spirit had fled. He clambered the stairs to his chamber, not bothering to creep quietly, slammed his door, and felt at peace. He slept soundly that night. No pattering footsteps fled swift by his door. No streak of candlelight or shuffling foot of man told of the return of Thomas Allen to his room above. The door of his room stood open all night. The questing winds ruffled his papers, sent them fluttering like sprites down the stairs. His candles burnt low, guttered, and died. Thomas Allen did not come home that night. Next morning, when the troopers went with leather buckets over to the King's Ditch to draw water for their horses, they found the body of Thomas Allen lying dead in the grove of trees which border that ditch to this day. A great horse pistol bullet had torn a jagged hole through his chest. His mouth was open. His tongue would mutter its midnight spells no more. His eyes were wide and full of horror. They had seen something in the stars at last to quiet their evil questing forever. There was a trail of blood, thick gouts of it, from the foot of the staircase by the porter's lodge, through the college, and across the grass to the grove where the body lay. A pistol was missing from the rack in the armory. One or two soldiers had heard the shot in the small hours. It was clear enough. The necromancer, haunted by his own evil, had shot himself outside the armory door, and by superhuman effort Wagner dragged himself to the grove, die under the stars with whom he had communed for so long. Suicide. That was the general verdict. Byfield said nothing. In his fanatic mind he was convinced that he had shot Allen in the form of the cat. Already he saw himself facing his God on the day of judgment, the curse of Cain heavy on his soul. Heaven denied him, hell his remorseless end, because he had committed the unforgivable sin of murder. In his mind's eye he saw the book open, the accuser confronting and the judgment pronounced. Now art thou cursed from the earth. That night he heard men with slow and lumbering steps and muttered words bring the dead body up the narrow stairway to the room above. They laid the dead man on his own bed, there in the empty room with his books of magic, his prisms and evil instruments, his magic scrabblings on the blackboard. They closed the door and went away. The silence was paralyzing. It dropped like a pall on the gate tower. There was no man in the armory below and a dead man in the room above. Adeniram was utterly alone. The silent horror of the night gripped him. He fell on his knees and prayed in an agony of mind that the dead might come alive again, that his sin might pass from him, that the curse of Cain be lifted from his soul, and all be it as it was before he fired that pistol shot. As he finished praying, he heard the door above open. Soft, pattering steps crept down the stairs. They passed his door. They were gone before he could open it, had he dared. For a moment he felt a wave of relief. His prayer had been answered. He was not alone. The dead had come to life. No longer did the curse of murder lie on his soul. Then fresh horror seized him. Allen was dead enough. He had seen that for himself. What then was this soft, pattering thing which had gone out into the night? He opened his door and listened. Not a sound. Allen's door above was open. So was his window. Adeniram Byfield heard again the soft rustle of the wind in the dead man's papers, felt the soft night breeze pass on his cheek. Somehow he must close that door before the pattering, fury-throated thing returned. He must shut off the mutilated body of Allen with its staring eyes, pathetically open mouth, from his foul spirit, which would assuredly return to possess it. Perhaps, if he could do that, he, Adeniram Byfield, might earn pardon on the judgment day. He steeled himself to creep up the stairs. At any moment the thing might return. He reached Allen's door. It stood open. A new and guttering candle lit the room. The bed was empty. No dead man, shot mangled with staring eyes, lay there. The coverlet was white and smooth. A sharp breath of wind through the window caught the candle flame. It wavered sideways like a little yellow pennon. It flickered, went out. Byfield stood there in the pregnant, listening dark. Then he heard it. Soft, furry footsteps were coming up the open stairs. Stealthy, menacingly. There was no quick, cat-like scamper. They were stalking him. Byfield shrank back and yet back into the darkened room, towards the bed. The furry feet were on the last stairs. They came softly over the threshold of the door. Then in the pitch blackness he saw it. In a lambent radiance he saw the cat, mangled, menacing, its chest and neck sagging in a bloody apron of tattered flesh. It crept towards him. Its eyes smoked with evil. It crouched to spring. Adeniram Byfield back towards the bed. The cat followed, low as a tiger, to the floor. The bed touched the back of his knees. He dropped down upon it, sitting. The crouching cat, bloody and torn, sprang through the air. "Oh, my God, make haste for my help," babbled Adeniram Byfield in a last surge of words. He fell upon the bed, his hands scrambling at the coverlet. They closed on the dead, stiff hands of the body of Thomas Allen. When dawn came a few minutes later, greening in the east and palely lighting the chamber, there was no cat. The stiff body of Thomas Allen asked only for burial. Adeniram Byfield was on his knees, gabbling for forgiveness. And as you will remember from the preface to this sermon, now in the college library. He died that same year. The Dead Killed Him in His Own Grave by J. Wentworth Day. A man seeking treasure in an empty grave at midnight in the chapel of a famous Cambridge college. Suddenly, in the cold quiet of the dark chapel, the soft, shuffling footsteps of a procession of dead men, newly risen from their graves, the low, haunting singing of an unseen choir of long-buried priests, dons, and students. Then, a rending of timbers, a clanging crash which shook the college, and the midnight seeker of gold and silver lay dead, blood splattered in the open grave. Today, if you go to Jesus College in Cambridge and enter the chapel, you will find a worn gravestone near the southwest pier of the chapel tower, where the transepts cross. You can pick out the pier from the others because it is the only one to have a dogtooth molding. Go down on hands and knees, and provided you have the right light and sharp sight, you might be able to pick out this curious inscription, Nicful Mas, followed by the year 1652. 10 years earlier, just before the Civil War spread fear and bloodshed throughout England, a certain Mr. John Poley, son of a Suffolk squire whose descendants still live on the same estates today, set off in a coach, taking a pair of pistols and with 2 armed guards to pay his loyal duty to His Majesty King Charles I, who was then at Nottingham gathering his armies about him. The coach carried a heavy load of gold and silver plate, the property of Jesus College. The college authorities, being loyal subjects and having no use for the upstart Cromwell, whose proper name was Williams, although historians are apt to overlook that fact, had decided that since the king needed men and money to defend his throne against the rebels, they, not being fighting men, would send him their plate in order that it might be melted down to help finance the king's armies. Every member of the college, from the master downwards, knew that at any moment they were likely to be expelled by order of Cromwell, the self-styled King of the Fens, whose word was law in the eastern counties. So they got rid of the plate before Cromwell could lay his coarse hands upon it. Not all the plate, however, was sent to the king. Some was buried within the college grounds. More was hidden in the buildings themselves. The chapel organ, a charming piece of work which had been put into the chapel in 1634 by Richard Sterne, the master, who was Archbishop Laud's chaplain, was also hidden. That was not difficult, since it was quite small. The Earl of Manchester, Cromwell's deputy, marched into the college at the head of a body of his troops in January 1643, evicted the master and fellow, and installed new men in their places. He noted in the treasury book, in the course of an inventory of the college furnishings, that there were only 3 pieces of plate. The Earl no fool realized if indeed he did not already know that most of the plate had been sent to the king. It is possible that he heard the rumor that the rest of it had been hidden, but I can find no record of him ordering a search to be made for it. War was rather more important at that moment. We might not know much more about this affair had not the diary of George Evans, 1649 to 1658, come to light in an edited form in the first quarter of the century. Evans, like Cromwell, was a Welshman. He was given a Fellowship of Jesus in 1650 by the Committee for Reforming the Universities. He came from Radnor, was an independent, and became vicar or rector of Marston Monceau in Shropshire in 1654. When Charles II came to the throne, Parson Evans, true to form, declared himself a royalist and hung on to his living until he died in 1672. The only reason why we need take any heed of this Welsh opportunist is that on the date of June 11, 1652, he records this. June 11, 1652. Present, ye master, Mr. Woodcock and Mr. Mashan, fellows with Mr. Thomas Buck, Thankful Thomas, and Robert Hitchcock, digging. We digged up yesterday a treasury plate hid in the master's orchard, and all were 17 pieces. Then follows a list. Search till prayers, but quorum, whether there be not yet others pieces, and yet treasure hid by ye former society. Thomas says Mr. German could have vouched for more. You will know the name of Thankful Thomas. He is undoubtedly the man whose skeleton lies beneath the gravestone, with the part-worn inscription upon it near to the southwest pier of the Tower Chapel. Gervais Germain was a middle-aged bachelor, a master of arts, who had been the college organist and choir master in the time of Richard Sterne, the expelled master. He was a dry, sardonic little man, desperately poor since he lost his job as organist when the organ was removed and hidden. He lived in lodgings in Cambridge and appeared to own only one suit of clothes, patched, worn, and of semi-clerical cut. He looked like a hard-up parson. He had an odd, pedantic way of speech which made some people believe that he was a little queer in the head, and we regard him as an eccentric, by no means mad, whose ruling passion in life was church music and whose spiritual home was the college chapel. We have a fair picture of the man. Thankful Thomas was sexton of the chapel. The college order books records in the year 1650, Thomas constitutes es custos templi. In fine, he was both chapel clerk and sexton. As such, Thankful Thomas considered that he was the boss of the chapel, when the master or priest were not in sight. Gervais Germain had a key to the chapel. He had kept it from the day, 10 years previously, when he had lost his job as organist. Nothing and nobody could keep him out of the chapel. Neither the new master nor the new fellow wanted to bar him from the place, since he was a harmless little man and pitiful. Thankful Thomas loathed the sight of him. He found Germain roaming about the place early in the morning and late at night. He would appear like a ghost from a dark corner, noiselessly, and give Thomas the shock of his life. Germain had a sharp tongue, a supercilious manner, and the habit of addressing Thomas as though the latter was not only his servant, but his inferior, particularly in intellect. Thomas was a dour, pig-headed, greedy fellow, not well educated, but very jealous of what he considered to be his rights and duties. He boiled with rage inwardly when, perhaps in the course of dusting the choir stalls, or polishing church vessels on a Sunday afternoon of utter peace, with motes of dust dancing in the colored light which filtered through the stained-glass window, he would suddenly sense that he was being watched. Looking upward, he would see the sardonic parchment face of Germain, peering down at him from the tower arcade or from the nuns' gallery. Thomas had heard the rumors of buried treasure. He jumped to the conclusion that Germain had more than a clue to its whereabouts. That, he argued, was why the ex-organist was always prowling about the chapel, exploring every nook and cranny, high and low. He came to the conclusion that the treasure must be hidden near the chapel tower. In the top of that tower was the belfry. In the belfry hung a huge old bell engraved with a line of St. Mark and an inscription in Latin. That bell, called Mark, had not been rung for years. If it had been cast in pre-Reformation days and had belonged to the nunnery of St. Rajman, the original occupants of the college buildings before the college was formed. The reason why the heavy booming note of Mark was never used was simple. The belfry timbers were so rotten that they were unsafe. The dark winding staircase in the northeast angle wall of the north transept leads up to the arcaded Norman gallery, which you can still see. The old belfry was above it. Thankful Thomas had seen Germain prowling about in the gallery more than once. One day he plucked up his courage, went up the dark staircase, and crept along the Norman gallery, which had no protecting railing. He had to clutch each pillar as he passed, since the slightest slip would send him hurtling down to the stone floor beneath. There was a worm-eaten ladder on the roof of the transept, which led up to the belfry window. Thomas was certain that he had seen Germain climb this ladder. When, however, he himself reached the ladder and realized its shakiness, he dared not face it. He was much heavier than Germain. He had a superstitious terror of the silent belfry, and left it severely alone. Thomas was far more at home on the floor of the chapel. He gave it the most loving attention. Not a stone was left untapped. He spent hours stamping on each one in turn, and listening for the hollow note which would tell him that there was a secret chamber beneath. A line of crosses cut into the flagstone on one part of the floor excited him tremendously. You can see a familiar line of crosses cut in some of the paving stones in one of the most inner courtyards in St. James Palace, London. They mark the burial place of 16 leprous maidens who died there when the old palace was a hospital and not a palace. The crosses on the nave floor of Jesus College Chapel had, however, nothing to do with leprosy or buried bodies. They merely marked the old processional paths of the nuns. Thomas hammered each one of them. Not the slightest note of hollowness rewarded him. Then he arrived at a large plain stone, not far from the southwest pier of the tower. The moment he banged on it, he got the hollow sound he had been waiting for. There was a vault beneath. In that vault, Thomas decided, lay the missing treasure. He determined to get it. He noticed that immediately above the stone hung the old bell rope belonging to the dumb bell of St. Mark. The evening sunlight shone through the chapel windows onto the stone on a midsummer day in 1652. Thankful Thomas was kneeling on the stone examining it, running his fingers round the edges, tapping it, and listening when suddenly a shadow of a man fell across the stone. Thomas leapt to his feet. He thought it was the master. It was Gervase German. I bid you good evening, Goodman Thomas, said German dryly. I, like you, work late in this place. I have been visiting old friends, all, alas, dead, who lie under these stones. A word with one here and there, just with another, even a snatch of songs we sang long ago, with yet another of the dead. We often commune here. I see that you do the same. Who prays your friend who lies beneath that stone? Gervase German eyed the flushed, defiant Thomas with sardonic ridicule. I am no fool, idle fellow to talk to the dead, Thomas said surely. A chapel clerk has more important matters to do. I have no time for your wild fancies, and let not your nose pry into my affairs further. Very true, Master Thomas, German replied. Very true. You are indeed right. This stone on which you are kneeling, and to which I thought you were whispering or tapping a message, is not the grave of a man, yet. Has our chapel clerk made up his mind who is to be the tenant? One of our new fellows, perhaps? Maybe my unworthy self. It would please me greatly to sleep my last sleep under the floor of this chapel which I've served for so many years. But no doubt, Master Sexton, you have reserved the grave for yourself. That thought crossed my mind when I saw you lying on the stone, measuring yourself for it as it were. But there, you are no man of education, as you would admit, so I would not bother you with the riddle of the Prince of Denmark. What is he that builds stronger than either the mason, the shipwright, or the carpenter? I have no time for riddles, and I am digging no grave, said Thomas. Begone, Master German. Tush, Goodman Thomas, German answered suavely. Are you so short of work as not to dig for death as for hid treasure? Some indeed may dig for treasure, and find only death. He watched Thomas' face narrowly. Thomas flushed, hesitated. Obviously German knew what he had been looking for. Equally obviously German knew that the treasure lay under the stone. Perhaps better to compromise than to make an enemy of him. Hidden treasure, Master German? There may be more sense in what you say than I thought of. Maybe we could look for it together. And if you take your fair share, you may not be as poor as you look now. And no other man but we two need know of it. Nonsense, Thomas, German said sharply. I know nothing of this hidden treasure. It belongs to my friends, the dead, and with them it shall remain. I shall be no part of it to break trust with them. Let them hold it until the resurrection, when their other friends, who claimed it, may claim it from them. I have a great deal of awe for the dead, Thomas. They can do so much, and neither you nor I can do aught to harm them. But they have dreadful powers. You are a brave man, Thomas, to stay in this chapel so often and so late. Do you not know that it is full of dead voices and the presence of dead men? This is their house, in which they walk when night falls. Surely you know how the last chapel clerk, Goodman Dean, who held office before you, died? Dean, they tell me he died raving mad. But why should that trouble me? I knew not the man, nor how weak his head may have been. Goodman Dean died only 2 years ago in August, German replied evenly. He was wandering in his head. A harmless man, but with no light of life or reason in his eyes. Always he would mutter to himself, I should have rung, and so muttering he died. What should he have rung? Asked Thomas. Do you not know the old belief that when the dead rise up out of their graves at night and walk in the quiet of the sleeping world, the ringing of a church bell shall disperse them? They flee back to their graves and leave the night to the living. Old Mark could not speak for Goodman Dean on that night when the dead came alive in this chapel, for Mark has not spoken for 20 years or more. It was on the night of August 7th, which is the festival of the name of Jesus, the greatest night of the whole year for the poor folk who are dead. Here, in this chapel, they assemble, both men and women, I am told, at midnight for lauds. They say you will hear them coming down a staircase which leads from outside, and others entering by a door in the church wall, which has long been locked up. They line up on these crosses which you see here in the stone in a double line of men and women, for the old nuns are of the company, and then they go in procession round the church, dark though it may be. They need no light. Many here in this town of Cambridge say they've heard the singing soft and low of the dead, but I have yet to meet a man who has set eyes on them, unless of course it was poor Dean, and he was in no state to tell us what he had seen. Thomas looked at him with dull obstinacy. He had made up his mind to have no more truck and share no more secrets with this drivelling old man, who spoke such fancies. He determined to pass it off as of no account. Not fancy, Master German. Little credit to it, since none can verify it. Why should it worry me? True or not, since I never enter this chapel after midnight. I do not believe your tale, Master German, and I believe still less that you know nothing of the treasure. That, in any case, is none of my business. It is, no doubt, as unsubstantial as your ghosts. I bid you good night. He stumped off. He left treasure seeking strictly alone for a few weeks in order to raise no more suspicions in German's mind. Then he decided to enter the church on a certain night, lock the door, display no light, take a crowbar and iron jemmies wherewith to lever up the long flat stone, and dispose of the matter once and for all. Either find the treasure where he thought it lay, or accept defeat. At 11:15 on the night of August 7th, 1652, a date whose significance has gone clean out of his head, thankful Thomas, crowbar over his shoulder, jemmies in his hand, stole softly up to the chapel door, unlocked it quietly, slipped in, and locked the door behind him. He was in the chapel alone, alone with the dead. The distilled yellow light of a near harvest moon shone dimly through the windows. There was just enough light for Thomas to see his way to the stone. He knelt down, chipped at the edge of the stone, made an aperture big enough to take the end of the crowbar, inserted it, and heaved hard on it. The stone, bedded in the floor for centuries, groaned, moved slightly. Thomas threw his weight once more on the crowbar. The stone moved gently upward. He slipped the jemmy into the crack to prevent the end of the stone slipping back into place. Then he went to work on the other end with the crowbar. Gradually he prized up the other end of the long slab. Another jemmy was slipped into the crack. Then Thomas thrust the crowbar between the middle of the stone and the lip of the vault, and heaved mightily. Up came the stone. A second later it fell back against the foot of the tower with a hollow crash. A long, dark vault. A grave was exposed. Thomas probed it gently with a crowbar. It was about 5 feet deep. With his heart in his mouth, he sat on the edge, felt for the bottom, and dropped. The grave came up to his shoulders. Thomas bent down and on hands and knees groped from one end of the vault to the other, his hands exploring every inch of space. The vault was empty. All this had taken time. About 3/4 of an hour had passed. Overhead the college clock boomed out the strokes of midnight. Thomas paid no heed. He was groping with his fingers on the floor of the vault to see if yet another stone slab was there, hiding the entrance to a lower vault. Suddenly he stiffened. Cold fear gripped him. Overhead in the locked, empty chapel he heard the soft, shuffling footsteps of quiet presences. They were converging from two sides of the chapel. They met. By the sound of their feet it was plain that they were arranging themselves in two orderly lines. Thankful Thomas crouched in his dark grave, paralyzed. Came the sound of soft music. There seemed to be no musical arrangement, but the cadences, the nuances of tone were enchanting. Thomas almost lost his fear and wonder. Then the music resolved itself into a continuous melody. A voice clear and haunting sang, The words of the psalm were plain to hear. When the Lord turned again the captivity of Sion, then were we like unto them that grieved. The psalm went on to the end. Thomas listened, petrified. Then came the shuffle of feet. Somewhere in the darkness a door was opened softly. In a mad moment of terror, thankful Thomas remembered Gervais German's tale of the procession of dead men and women round the chapel. The feet above were moving. Soon they would reach the edge of his grave. The dead, men and women from centuries before, would look down upon his crouching form from eyeless sockets. Thomas remembered that the ringing of a church bell was the only power on earth which could disperse this dread procession. He sprang from the grave. He leapt to the bell rope and swung on it. Up in the belfry of owls and bats, great Mark boomed into sudden life. One resounding clang. The crash of falling timber, the shattering clang as the great bell hit the chancel floor, scattered the brains of thankful Thomas, rammed his crushed body into the grave he had dug and splintered itself in flying metal. Thankful Thomas had opened his own grave. You may see the stone to this day. When the master and fellows forced an entry into the chapel at dawn, and men climbed up to the shattered belfry, they found securely perched in a corner on the only unbroken piece of flooring the exquisite little chamber organ which had been put there in 1642 to save it from Cromwell's godless troopers. After the Restoration, Gervais Germain returned as organist to the chapel he loved. It had been redecorated, refurbished, and brought back to its full glory about 1663. A choral service was held to mark the return of the king and the return to the Anglican Church. German sat in his old place at the organ. The sweet voices of the boy choristers were singing the last verse of the 126th Psalm. He that now goeth on his way weeping and beareth forth good seed shall doubtless come again with joy and bring his sheaves with him. The organ notes suddenly faltered. The choir went on singing the Gloria without music. Then the master saw with horror that the thin, pitiful form of Gervais German, who loved his chapel better than life itself, was slumped forward. The grey head was on the organ keys. Gervais German had gone to join his friends, the dead.